Supporters of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu have presented his case to former US President Donald Trump, highlighting alleged human rights abuses and injustice in Nigeria, particularly targeting Kanu and the Igbo people. They argue that Nnamdi Kanu, a British citizen, has been unlawfully detained for years without trial, after being kidnapped and tortured in Kenya and transferred back to Nigeria. The group recalled the 2017 incident when Nigerian security forces allegedly killed over 27 pro-Trump Igbo youths in Port Harcourt during a peaceful celebration of Trump's inauguration. Advocates claim the Nigerian government is enabling ethnic and religious cleansing, especially targeting Christian communities in the southeast, and warn of a broader jihadist threat. The Nigerian director of the Department of State Services, DSS, has publicly advised citizens to arm and defend themselves, which many see as confirmation that Nigeria is a failed state. Clergy and activists are now openly advocating for community-based self-defense and calling on the diaspora, especially Igbos in the US and Europe, to fund and organize local security efforts. Bruce Fine, International Counsel for Nnamdi Kanu, condemned the Nigerian government for violating multiple international human rights laws and delaying Kanu's trial indefinitely. Fine suggested international sanctions against Nigeria, including visa bans, suspension from the United Nations General Assembly, and trade restrictions until Kanu is released. Chief Uggon and other American advocates warned that continued instability and persecution could spark mass migration from Nigeria, urging immediate international intervention. The critic concludes with a passionate plea for Nigerians to understand their situation, make personal plans for safety, and for the US government to recognize and act against the crisis in Nigeria. I want to begin by drawing your attention to the extraordinary step taken by the supporters of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, when they carried his case across the Atlantic Ocean and laid it directly at the feet of former United States President Donald Trump. It is not every day that a group of concerned citizens bypasses the traditional channels of international diplomacy and appeals straight to a former commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces. In doing so, they sought to expose the alleged human rights abuses that they say have been inflicted upon Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and, by extension, the entire Igbo ethnic community in southeastern Nigeria. By presenting evidence and testimony in Washington, D.C., they hope to shine a spotlight on what they described as a pattern of injustice and government-sanctioned violence that has festered for years without meaningful redress. The story of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu is both dramatic and tragic. He is a British citizen who became known around the world for his fiery radio broadcasts and his outspoken advocacy of self-determination for the people of Biafra. In 2015, he was arrested in Lagos, Nigeria, on charges of treasonable felony related to a failed secessionist campaign. After spending nearly a year in detention, he was released on bail, only to vanish later that same year. His supporters say that he was kidnapped in Nairobi, Kenya, and subjected to torture by operatives of the Nigerian security services before being clandestinely transported back to Nigeria in 2021. Since that moment, Mazi Nnamdi Kanu has remained behind bars, held in solitary confinement, denied a prompt trial date, and repeatedly shuttled through court appearances that end in indefinite adjournments. His international counsel, Mr. Bruce Fine, has argued that this treatment contravenes at least 16 treaties and conventions to which Nigeria is a signatory, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, making his detention both arbitrary and unlawful in the eyes of global human rights law. When the delegation met with former President Donald Trump, they drew attention not only to the legal quagmire surrounding Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's detention, but also to a harrowing episode that took place on January 20th, 2017 in Port Harcourt. That was the day when Americans celebrated the inauguration of Donald Trump in the United States, and many members of the Igbo community in Port Harcourt held festivities to mark the start of a new administration they hoped would be more sympathetic to their cause. According to eyewitnesses and human rights observers, Nigerian security forces moved in on a group of young Igbo men and women, many of whom were waving American flags and chanting "USA, USA, USA" and opened fire. The exact death toll is disputed, but credible reports put the number at 27 or higher. Several participants were arrested, and none of the security officers involved have ever faced charges. The delegation reminded President Trump that these were people celebrating a democratic transfer of power, not staging an insurrection, and yet they were met with lethal force. They implored him to investigate that massacre and to hold those responsible to account. Beyond that massacre in Port Harcourt, the supporters of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu emphasized a broader pattern of what they called religious and ethnic cleansing in Nigeria's southeast. They described communities under siege from armed groups they referred to as bandits and terrorists, whom they believe are operating with the tacit approval of certain elements within the federal government. They recounted attacks on farmers in their villages, invasions of local markets, and the burning of homes. What began as a handful of localized skirmishes has, in their telling, grown into a concerted campaign to drive Christian Igbo farmers and traders off their ancestral lands. They pointed out that many of the southeast's forests and fertile river valleys have become danger zones, where anyone working the land risks kidnapping, extortion, or worse. Those claims were reinforced when, in a highly unusual public statement, the Director General of the Department of State Services addressed the nation and told ordinary Nigerian citizens to arm themselves and defend their lives and property against those terrorists and bandits. In many countries, the equivalent of that position would make it a matter of public record that the state acknowledges its own inability to guarantee security for its people. In the United States, if the Secretary of Homeland Security were to advise Americans to organize militia units because the federal government could not protect them, it would be front-page news. The fact that such advice came from the Director General of the Department of State Services in Nigeria painted a bleak picture. Either the state is failing in its core duty, or it has decided to outsource violence to non-state actors. For the Igbo community, that statement confirmed fears that they were on their own. In response, members of the clergy and civil society activists in Nigeria, along with diaspora groups in the United States and Europe, have begun openly organizing self-defense committees. In towns from Awka to Onitsha, village elders are meeting in church halls after Sunday services to discuss plans for local vigilante groups. In London, the Igbo Union is hosting fundraisers to buy radios, uniforms, and basic communication equipment. In Atlanta, the Biafran youth movement has called on all its members to donate to an emergency fund that will pay stipends to young men willing to patrol roads in their home communities. These efforts are motivated not by a desire for conflict, but by a desperate urge for self-preservation. When the delegation from Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's legal team spoke in Washington, they were accompanied by Mr. Bruce Fein, an American constitutional lawyer who has worked on high-profile human rights cases for decades and who was once counsel to President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Bruce Fein condemned the Nigerian government for its indefinite postponement of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's trial and for the lack of transparency in the charges against him. He reminded his audience that under the rule of law, the state is supposed to bear the burden of proof, to present specific evidence, and to allow the accused a full opportunity to defend himself. In Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's case, however, Mr. Bruce Fein said that the indictments lack any plausible detail, refer only to broad allegations of incitement or terrorism, and fail to point to a single act of violence or a single victim. He pointed out that Mazi Nnamdi Kanu has been held in solitary confinement for more than 4 years without a trial date, that each court date has been postponed on flimsy procedural grounds, and that his conditions of detention have been described by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Mr. Bruce Fein suggested that the United States and other democracies should consider a variety of measures to pressure the Nigerian government to release Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, including an executive order suspending visas for Nigerian officials, an arms embargo, trade sanctions, and even a 1-year suspension of Nigeria's membership in the United Nations General Assembly until Mazi Nnamdi Kanu is set free. Alongside Mr. Bruce Fein in Washington was Chief Uggon Nnamdi Okoro, who serves as chairman of the United American Coalition for Human Rights in the Southeast. Chief Uggon described how, over the course of 2 decades, he had witnessed the transformation of southeastern Nigeria from a land of thriving rural communities and bustling market towns into a zone of intermittent violence and creeping fear. He recounted how, in the years before Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's first detention in 2015, the region was relatively tranquil, even as challenges simmered in other parts of the country. But he said that once the federal government took a hard line against Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and his followers, the crackdown seemed to spill over into ordinary life. He said that if a spokesman for a liberation movement could be stigmatized as a dangerous criminal, then any ordinary villager might find himself targeted next. Chief Uggon warned that this sense of vulnerability is prompting an exodus. He said that he had spoken with entire families preparing to leave behind their farms and their ancestral homes because they no longer felt safe. The children of those families, he said, are the next generation of brain drain. The gathering in Washington concluded with a heartfelt appeal from the supporters of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. They implored the United States government to recognize the unfolding crisis in Nigeria as not merely a series of isolated incidents, but as a test of international resolve to uphold the dignity and rights of religious and ethnic minorities. They asked that people of conscience everywhere learn the story of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and of the Igbo community's struggle for justice. They urged individuals to write their representatives in their home countries, to participate in local vigils and prayer services, and to donate to organizations providing legal aid, humanitarian relief, and secure communication channels for activists on the ground in southeastern Nigeria. Hearing their voices, it becomes impossible to remain indifferent. When a former president of the United States considers a plea from citizens of a foreign land, it signals that the world is watching. It reminds us that the promise of human rights is not confined within borders, that the duty of governments, wherever they are, is to protect life and liberty. It forces us to ask whether we are willing to let allegations of torture, kidnapping, indefinite detention without trial, and ethnic persecution slip into the shadows. It challenges us to decide how far we will go to stand with those who find themselves beyond the pale of their own national justice systems. At a personal level, I find myself moved by the courage of the clergy and activists who continue to speak out in Nigeria despite the very real threat of reprisals. I am struck by the determination of the Igbo diaspora, who have embraced the memory of their homeland's woes even as they build new lives abroad. And I am humbled by the willingness of a former American president to listen to a case that most would have dismissed as regionally confined or politically too volatile. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's story is far from over. Whether he eventually walks free on the streets of Abuja or remains in a cell waiting for an imaginary trial date, the questions his case raises about the rule of law, about the protection of minorities, and about the international community's resolve to enforce its own declared values will linger. When the voices of those who have been silenced are finally heard, we discover how much remains at stake, how much justice still needs to be done, and how the arc of that justice depends as much on our willingness to listen as on our capacity to act. In the next part of the discussion, Chief Uggon Nnamdi Okoro reflected on the steps he took to truly understand the Igbo people, what he referred to as the ancestry of the Igbo, what makes them who they are, and why they hold so dearly to their land and traditions. He spoke of spending time living among farmers in Enugu, traders in Onitsha markets, fishermen along the Niger River, and artisans in villages that even Google Maps scarcely acknowledge. By immersing himself in their everyday lives, working beside them in cassava farms, attending morning prayers in small chapels, listening to folk tales by firelight, he learned not just their history under British colonial rule, but also how that flawed handover of power in 1960 sowed the seeds for decades of misunderstanding and marginalization. As a foreigner with a mission, Chief Uggon said he had to ask himself 3 critical questions, which he encouraged every Nigerian to ponder. First, do I really know what is happening around me? Do I understand the forces at work, both seen and unseen? He recalled charting the movements of armed groups through satellite images and church council reports, then cross-checking those routes against where villages had suddenly emptied overnight. He described tracing the origins of so-called farmers-herders clashes back to land grabs by powerful interests, and how those disputes were being manipulated to drive local Christians from their homes. His second question, he said, came straight from advice his father, a United States Marine Corps Staff Sergeant, had passed on. What is my plan? He told the audience how he had brought that military ethos into civilian life, organizing community watch teams armed with nothing more lethal than whistles, flashlights, and two-way radios, and setting up protocols so that neighbors knew whom to call and where to gather if danger approached. He urged Igbo villagers to draft their own contingency plans for evacuation or defense, from stockpiling food and medicine to identifying trusted forums, church halls, town squares, union offices, where decisions could be made rapidly. The third question, he said, was the most personal. Am I taking this to heart? He stressed that when injustice lurks so close, when families vanish in the night, when young women like Leah Sharibu remain hostages of terrorists for years on end, and when students like Deborah Samuel are stoned to death while uniformed officers stand by, then indifference becomes complicity. Chief Uggon admitted that he too once hesitated when fresh reports of abductions reached him. But he decided that if former President Donald Trump could be shown footage of 27 unarmed young men killed for waving American flags, then every concerned individual could be enlisted as an advocate, knocking on doors in the United States Capitol, sending emails to European commissioners, and sharing updates on social media until the world simply could not look away. Evans Osuagwu, a second panelist whose own journey to advocacy began after his family home was burned in a nighttime raid, reminded everyone that evil, no matter how entrenched, is never permanent. He drew on a phrase his grandmother used whenever hardship struck. Every storm ends, and even the tallest mountain can be worn down. He pointed out that the mass killings of Christians in Nigeria's north, where entire congregations have been butchered in their churches, were tragic proof of violence unleashed by a handful of ruthlessly motivated actors. Yet history shows that such campaigns of terror always expire, if only because the conscience of the world recoils at the sight of multitudes living in fear. Mr. Evans implored the United States Congress to uphold that conscience by reinstating Nigeria on the list of countries of particular concern for religious freedom violations. He reminded listeners that under the Trump administration, Nigeria had carried that designation, which compelled U.S. diplomats to press harder for accountability and opened the door to targeted sanctions. He observed that under the Biden administration, That label had been removed, an act that, to many observers, signaled a dangerous reprieve for a government that had neither halted the atrocities nor ensured justice for kidnapping victims like Leah Sharibu, now 10 years old and still held by Boko Haram, nor for Deborah Samuel, the 20-year-old student whose killer remains at large. When Father Solomon Chukwuemeka, a Catholic priest from Abia State, spoke about how Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's imprisonment had affected his family and the Igbo community at large, his voice grew solemn. He described the anguish of the detainee's mother, who turns 70 next month, but still makes the pilgrimage to every Abuja court appearance, clutching a photograph of her son. He spoke of the sleepless nights his wife endures, praying in the flicker of candlelight while anxiously awaiting news of fresh adjournments. And he reminded his congregation that when a man of such moral stature, whom many now call the Nelson Mandela of Biafra, is confined in solitary detention for over 4 years, it is not just one life on hold, but the hopes of an entire people. Father Solomon underscored that solitary confinement is a form of psychological torture, driving inmates toward despair within months. Yet Mazi Nnamdi Kanu has endured it with an unbroken resolve, sustained by a belief that his voice amplifies centuries of grievances. He has spoken against corruption, against nepotism, and against policies that allowed terrorists to overrun schools and markets. And because he wields the power of the microphone rather than the barrel of a gun, he has never physically harmed anyone. His only weapons have been words and recorded interviews, messages that resonate with farmers whose crops are seized and traders whose livelihoods are extorted. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, after 9 months of hearings, concluded unanimously that Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's detention violates fundamental human rights norms and called for his immediate and unconditional release. The Nigerian government, however, has ignored that ruling, just as it disregarded the decision of the Nigerian Court of Appeal in June 2022, which quashed all charges and ordered his release, declaring his abduction in Kenya illegal. It is, as constitutional lawyer Bruce Fine told the audience, a supreme irony. The state that purported to bring him to trial has instead become the offender, seeking to make persecution pay by imprisoning the very man it should be prosecuting for kidnapping him. In the face of that blatant defiance, supporters argue that the international community must deploy both moral suasion and targeted measures. They propose tools familiar from the anti-apartheid era: an arms embargo, harmful trade tariffs, visa bans on select officials, and a formal suspension from the United Nations General Assembly until Nigeria complies with its own courts and with international law. A former American president's willingness to listen, they say, is a sign that these ideas are not fanciful, but entirely feasible. As the hearing drew to a close, Chief Uggon returned to the theme of self-empowerment. He warned that without a secure homeland, no amount of new highways or shiny shopping malls can flourish. If the bushes behind a village are crawling with marauders and the nearest police station lies abandoned, then life itself becomes a struggle. He urged governors in the southeast to meet jointly, to share intelligence, and to fund genuine community vigilante groups whose sole duty is protection, not patronage. He reminded them that security begets development. Only when families feel safe will children return to classrooms and farmers resume tilling their fields. When the lights finally dimmed in the Senate hearing room and the last video clip faded, an unmistakable impression lingered. This was not a remote crisis, but a test of universal principles. It reminded every listener that the preservation of human dignity demands more than sympathetic headlines. It demands action. Whether by reinstating Nigeria as a country of particular concern, banning weapons shipments, blocking assets of those who foment violence, or simply refusing to look away, the world has at its disposal many levers to help unlock the barred door of that solitary cell. On a personal note, I find myself awed by the determination of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's supporters, by the clergy who speak with prophetic boldness, and by the diaspora who have transformed sorrow at home into purpose abroad. Their story compels us to ask not only what we can do to secure the release of one man, but how we can uphold the rule of law for all. It reminds us that freedom is never a gift from a distant throne, but a right that must be claimed by those who are brave enough to press for it. And if light is the only thing powerful enough to banish darkness, then every act of conscience, every letter sent, every vow to remember, every embassy visit, becomes one more candle in a vigil that refuses to end. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.